happy now after lunch? The title that Elango has selected for me is Advancing the Frontiers of Learning, which is a concept which the Universal House of Justice has introduced as a phrase. And recently there was a video entitled The Frontiers of Learning. Did you all see that video?
Yeah.
Which shows it takes several parts of the world in which Baha'is are engaged in a certain process here in the 5-year plan, particularly with emphasis on the education of children and junior youth and various other aspects of the plan, study circles and so on. And it's very interesting, the term frontiers. You know what a frontier is? What is a frontier? Anyone know what a frontier is?
Wild West.
Oh, the Wild West, yes, we call that a frontier. A frontier is the furthest place that someone has gone, or a new place that someone has gone. In other words, a frontier is the border beyond which you have never been before. The border beyond which you're never been. Sometimes we refer to a frontier as the border of a country, but more often a frontier is a new area. They said, for example, when Lewis and Clark had to go across the United States, because originally they were only in the eastern part, and there was some in the western part that came by boat, but in the middle no one had been anywhere. And so they set out and they were going across the frontier. They had no Europeans had ever seen what they were going to see. They said that even when the man went to the moon, later on, 100 years later or more, they knew more about what they were going to see than Lewis and Clark knew when they were walking. Were they going to see dragons? What were they going to see? They had no idea, because the frontier is very exciting. And the House of Justice is saying right now, we are on frontiers. Because whenever I was growing up as a little boy, I would read about Lewis and Clark and the frontiers. I said, oh, there's never going to be a frontier again. You know, because the whole world was discovered. And I said, I wish I could be like them, where there's something new that no one has ever gone to before and discovered. You know that idea? And so now I read in the House of Justice that there's a new frontier, but it's a frontier of learning. I used to watch a TV show called Star Trek. Did you ever see that Star Trek?
Yes.
You watched that in Singapore?
Yeah.
And they said space is the frontier. And so then I was very excited. Actually, we used to have an old joke. They said, why did Captain Kirk go to the women's bathroom? You ever heard that joke? Why did Captain Kirk go to the women's bathroom? And the answer is, because he wanted to go where no man has gone before. For him, that was a frontier. So this is a very interesting idea that the House of Justice is saying that there's a frontier of learning, because it means there's something we have to discover and learn. It's not something they're telling us, you do A, B, C, and D, just do it. No, you have to go out and learn it and figure it out. This is why Baha'u'llah said there's 3 steps. You have to first listen to his call, then consult and figure it out. Here in Singapore, you may have to discover and learn something for yourselves that no other place has to learn, because every part of the world is different in its conditions and how this plan has to be carried out. So I want to talk about the 5-year plan. Before I do, though, I'm going to go back just a little bit, because we were talking about how to understand the 5-year plan. One has to understand the 500,000-year plan. Remember we said that? And what is the 500,000-year plan? Well, let me read what Chogyam Effendi says. He says, the faith of Baha'u'llah should indeed be regarded, if we wish to be faithful to the tremendous implications of its message, as the culmination of a cycle, the final stage in a series of successive, of preliminary and progressive revelations. These, beginning with Adam and ending with the Bab, have paved the way, and anticipating with an ever-increasing emphasis the advent of the Day of Days, in which he who is the promise of all ages should be made manifest. He says the revelation of Baha'u'llah is the culmination of a cycle and the beginning of a new cycle. And the one cycle goes back 6,000 years, and he says it began with Adam, and then all the other manifestations, even up to the Bab. And all of that has come before us, and now Baha'u'llah comes, and he brings a universal cycle. So this is a very interesting concept, because Elango says to me, well, what do you want me to do? because, Elango is the one that got the phone call. By the way, all of you, you better check your messages. You also got the call. I'm only using Elango as an example, but every one of you are going to get the call. And if you don't have a cell phone, it came somehow. I don't know how it came. But does anyone not have a cell phone in Singapore? I don't think so. In this country, everyone seems to have it. So he says, what do you want me to do? And he says, I have a plan. And I want you to help me carry out the plan. If you carry out the plan, you'll be answering my call. And so Elango says, well, what is a plan? You see, because Elango is very scientific. He says, what is a plan? And this is a very interesting concept, because as we read Baha'i history, we find that all of human history is proceeding according to a plan. Everything is, from the beginning of the cycle until the end of 5,000 and 6,000 years, it's proceeding according to a plan. In fact, we even know that all life proceeds according to a plan. We didn't know this before 1953, but in 1953, when Crick and Watson, those two scientists, they finally unraveled the DNA molecule. They found that life, whether it be a tree or an insect or an animal or a human being, begins as a plan, and everything is in that plan, in the first cell. So you take two human cells, they join together, there's conception. It's called a zygote. It's so small you cannot see it. You have to use a microscope. Has anyone seen it on the internet, or a picture of a human zygote? It looks like a tiny bacteria, so small. In that tiny bacteria is the whole plan of your body. Every single aspect of your plan, of your body. I mean, everything about your life. In fact, there's even more in there. There's even all your ancestry and all future things and all evolution. And if you need a tail, there's a tail in there, because you may need it if you need... Did you know that? It's all in that one plan. It's like 20,000 books worth of information in one cell. And every time you create a new cell, like 2 becomes 4, there's now 4 copies of that plan. 4 becomes 8, there's 8 copies of that plan. And now there's 100 trillion cells, and every one of those cells has a copy of that plan. So I can take one cell from you and I have that plan, because you began first as a plan. Now, hold on, I want to go to my notes, because this is very interesting. We'll come back to the 5-year plan. If you think about this building right now, look at this room now. Did you know that first it existed as a plan? Did you know that? First it existed as a plan. Somebody had to draw it, scale it out, design it, and make it a plan. Anything that's constructed by human beings existed first as a plan. A toaster, or a car, anything. First was a plan. Even if it wasn't written down, it was still in the mind of the thing. So you could say that anything you see created first existed as a plan. So you can really say that anything physical is the expression of mind over matter. First there's mind or spirit, and then that expresses itself in something physical. So a plan is the initial reality of something in the realm of the mind or the spirit or imagination, and then it finds expression in the world. So a plan is the imposition of spirit upon matter. That's what a plan is. And Baha'u'llah says, in the world of humanity, it's just like a plan. And he says, regard the world of humanity as a human body. So we have to understand that human civilization is growing just as sure as a baby grows. From the infant in the womb until a baby to a child and so on. So right now, human civilization is growing and the faith is growing. Nothing changes suddenly in the world. Is that right? Did you see anything like the baby pops out and he's fully grown, 25-year-old, and he's playing the piano? He's not doing that. He comes out slowly and he grows. You look at an acorn, or what do you call a seed for an oak tree here in this country?
Acorn.
You call it acorn? Okay, some countries they call it different. But you look at the seed of a tree, it might take 20 or 30 years before it becomes what it is. But at all times, that acorn is heading towards a tree. Have you ever planted an acorn and then suddenly it decides to turn into a banana tree halfway through? or something else? No, it's always proceeding on a path in a plan. So we have a plan now that we're supposed to carry out, but it's part of a larger plan, which is part of a larger plan. This is the whole point. You have to know where you fit in the plan. So, Alango says, what is a plan? And I want to first outline what are the general features of any plan. Once we know the features of a plan, then we can understand how to carry out. Well, the first general feature of any plan is that one has to adhere to it. One has to adhere to a plan in order for it to work, either a group or one individual. And every detail is important. So if someone made a plan for this particular building, and someone did, the drawings are very specific. So those windows in that corner will be drawn, and every little corner has to be adhered to by the builder, right down to the inch. Would you agree? Not even the inch, down to the millimeter. If you don't get it right, it doesn't work. And the builder needs to do this. So a plan has to be adhered to. Try to build something without a plan. For example, let's say you want to build a building and you don't have a plan, so you just go and you lay down a few bricks here and a few things here and wood here, chop, chop, chop. And you may find that when you get to the end, it's off a cliff or something like that, because you didn't conceive it as a plan first. So this is very important. It doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. Sometimes. It matters that once the plan is designed, we all adhere to it. You can't just say, well, I'm building this house according to this plan, but now I changed my mind and I want to do something, and I want a bedroom on the street or something. I don't know, something, you can't do that. Plans have to be adhered to. The second thing about a plan is that in carrying it out, sequence is important. Certain things must be done in a certain order. You do one thing, then you do another, then you do another and another, and it's very, very important. Sometimes people say to me, they show me a building, and they say, we built this from the ground up. And I always say, well, yeah, that is the best sequence for building a building. Try starting with the roof next time and see, how easy it will be. I don't even know why they say that we built this from the ground up, because everything is built from the ground up. Isn't that right? I guess what they really mean, of course, is that they didn't take an existing building and renovate it, but it's a funny saying. Any plan is like that. If you were to bake a cake, because even a recipe is a plan, isn't that right? If you were to bake a cake, is sequence important? You put this ingredient, that ingredient, you mix, you stir, and then you cook. You don't cook and then mix, is that right? You don't do it in any order. Sometimes when I go and buy something that's not assembled in the store, have you ever bought something big that is not assembled and you have to put it together? So sometimes I go and buy it, and I look at the instructions, and there's like 20 or 30 steps. Step 1, step 2, and I look at it, and I look at the picture on the box, and I put that down, and I say, well, this goes here, and I just try to do it myself. And I do it, look at the picture. And I get to like step 20, and I can't do the next step. And I can't figure out where does that go? I go back and I read, and it was step 2. And now I have to take the whole thing apart. And go all the way. Has anyone ever done that before? You have to take everything apart and say, I should have followed the plan because the plan says that sequence is important. Another thing about a plan that's interesting is that it requires collective action so that a large number of people can all do something that creates it in unison. For example, if you want to do something on your own, you have various choices. But if you want to do something in concert with everybody else, you have to all work together according to a plan. So think of anything large that's ever been built. Think of a large hydroelectric dam, or a building, or large canals, or things that took, thousands of individuals, tens of years to build. Everybody had to work together according to a plan. The most interesting example of this, I think, are the pyramids. Have anyone seen the pyramids? Has anyone actually gone there and seen them?
Yeah.
It's amazing, because for 4,000 years, they were the tallest man-made structure. Nothing was taller. And they tell us now that it took about 20 to 40,000 men, somewhere between 20 and 50 years to build the 3 pyramids. So that's a huge undertaking, wouldn't you agree? Now, as you're building the pyramids, you're one of these 50,000 men, over 50 years, you may not even live to see the thing you're building, okay? But you all have to work together. So every block is exactly the same size block. Every square is the same size square. You could not go and say, well, my hands are better to make this size block, and I want to make that size block. You could do it, but then would it be able to make a pyramid? The pyramid requires that everybody does certain things according to the plan, and they follow it in some way. In fact, Many people, they look at the pyramids and they think that they were not built by humans. There's all kinds of people, they say, oh, the pyramids were built by Martians, or they're built by aliens, or they had magical powers of anti-gravity. Have you ever read any of these things? They think all these crazy things. And scientists and historians, they say, this is not true. It's just that we don't realize the power of collective action. The power of collective action enables things to be done that could not be achieved any other way, because they take a plan, they all adhere to it, and they all do certain things at certain times. Think of an army in the field. If an army is in the field, they follow a general. Isn't that right? Now, it may be that in the field somebody says, well, Alango says, I want to go that way, I want to go that way, I want to do this. Isn't it better that they all work collectively? That they all stay together and they all do whatever the plan is? Another feature of a plan is that at every stage in executing a plan, it is very useful to know where you came from and where you're going. It's very useful to know where you came from and where you're going. For example, if I'm building a house, what is the main thing you really want when you build a house? It's probably the roof, because we say, I want a roof over my head. And the roof protects you from the rain and the sun and so on. But when you first start building a house, do you put the roof up first? You don't put the roof up first. In fact, it's one of the last things you do. But as you're building the foundation, then you build the walls. You know that a roof is going to go over this. You know that. So even as you're building the walls, you're kind of building the roof in your mind, because you know what you're doing. But you've heard, oh, hold on, this is not, it's dying. Sorry. Plug this in. So all the time you are aware of this. Now, the current 5-year plan, what the House of Justice is asking us to do, fulfills all the features of a plan that we just described. It fulfills all the features. It's part of a larger plan. It's going somewhere. We need to know where it's going. And sequence is very important, because in every part of the plan you need to do certain things at certain times. It's no good to say, well, I want to start building the roof now, if the walls aren't up. It's also no good to say, I really enjoy doing the foundation, I just want to keep doing the foundation. One has to adhere to a plan. I have a friend of mine who lives in the United States who recently had a baby that was born, a beautiful baby, and she was born without a hand. Just without one hand. It had one hand here, and it had no hand here. It looked like a stub, just the skin was grown over right there. And they were shocked. And the first thing the doctors did is they checked the baby completely. They checked its heart, its lungs, its kidney, its liver, its brain. It was 100% perfect, normal in every way, except it just didn't have a hand. And I said, how can it be? The doctor said, well, this is not that uncommon. Humans can be born without any particular limb or organ or something, and it happens more than you realize it happens. And they said, well, how could it happen? He said, it has only to do with timing. So the doctor said, it has only to do with timing. They said, at a certain time in the development of the child, it needs the hand to be developed. And if the hand doesn't develop at that time, for whatever reason, he said, we don't know the reason. Maybe there was an obstruction of the blood, or maybe there was a drug or a poison in the environment, or smoking, who knows. But for whatever reason, if the plan gets interrupted, the hand doesn't grow, and then the body goes on and does other things. And now, the child will never have, it'll go through life without a hand, because timing was important. So this is a very interesting idea that we learned from the human body, that you have to do things when they need to be done. That you can't do them before and you can't do them after. If you don't do them, perhaps they'll never get done. So this is a very interesting concept that we learn, because we know that the current plan, 5-year plan, is part of a larger plan. It's part of a life cycle. And it's a life cycle that's leading to world peace, the unity of the human race. It's leading to the golden age of the faith, maturity of humankind, which began 6,000 years ago. Many of the ancient prophets, like say Isaiah and Daniel, Ezekiel, Job, Micah, they predicted a day would come when humanity would live in peace on earth. Are you familiar with these predictions? The promise of the great peace? And a lot of us think they were prophets because they could foresee the future. But if I looked at a newborn baby and I said, in 20 years he'll be this size, he'll be this and that, he'll be big. Would I be a prophet? Would I be a prophet? Or would it just be that I understand the nature of organic growth? If I look at a sapling, which is a tiny tree, and I say, in 20 years that will be growing and it will have apples on it or something like that, am I a prophet? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe I see the future. But the point is that even prophecy of the human race can be viewed in the terms of the fact that we understand that everything is growing according to a plan. Now, let's look at the plan that we're in right now. I'll go back to my notes here. In March of 1916, actually 26th of March, 1916, the world was in the middle of a war. A war to end all wars, they called it. They said it was a war to end all wars. Of course, it wasn't. It didn't end all wars. There were wars after, but never had the world been in more dire straits than it was in 1916. And during that time, Abdu'l-Baha wrote a postcard to the Baha'is of the northeastern states of America. When I say a postcard, it was exactly that size. But it wasn't a picture postcard. It was just a white piece of cardboard on both sides. And he wrote on this postcard, and he sent it to the Baha'is of the northeast states. And the writing is so small. Now you can go see this postcard in Wilmette, under the temple. They still have the original postcard that Abdu'l-Baha mailed to the Baha'is. And then he gradually wrote a few more postcards for about a year's time, sending them to various parts of the United States. He sent some to the southern states, some to the northeast states, some to Canada, some to the west. And by the end of 1 year, I think he'd sent 14 of these little postcards. That's all they were little postcards. Shoghi Effendi said that these postcards were, quote, the weightiest spiritual enterprise launched in recorded history. That's what he said they were, the weightiest. Okay, think of all the spiritual enterprises in all of history. And what was on these postcards, he said, was the weightiest spiritual enterprise launched in recorded history. And Abdu'l-Baha put them on postcards that everybody could see. You know, the post office could see them. The mailman could see them, you know, because they were just written out there. Can you imagine you're a mailman carrying this thing, and you say, well, that's the weightiest spiritual enterprise in history, you know, and they probably didn't realize. I wonder in the next world, the postmen that delivered those, if they realize now what they were carrying was the greatest enterprise in recorded history. Shoghi Effendi said that what was on these postcards were the most potent agency for the development of the world administrative order. They said that what was on these postcards was a primary factor in the birth and efflorescence of the world order itself. In other words, something was on these 14 postcards that was going to cause the greatest transformation in the history of the human race for 6,000 years in the past to 500,000 years in the future. It was on these postcards. Now, they published these postcards and unveiled them to the Baha'is in 1919 because it took a while, because of the war, to get them around. And what do we call these postcards today? Does anyone know? They're called the Tablets of the Divine Plan. That's the term that we've heard of, the Tablets of the Divine Plan. And the Baha'is read the Tablets of the Divine Plan, and it was very specific about how to carry the light of Baha'u'llah's faith to every spot on the earth. And he names every place. He names every place, and he also gives various terms and conditions and what must be done. And many of the Baha'is in 1919 arose to travel and teach according to the Tablets of the Divine Plan. You know, Martha Root traveled around the world many times. She came even to this part of the world, and Mother and Father Dunn, Clara Dunn, they came to Australia because of it, and many Baha'is traveled. But in 1937, which was over 100 years, over 20 years since Abdu'l-Baha wrote them, Shoghi Effendi said it was time now to start carrying out the Tablets of the Divine Plan. We said, what do you mean start carrying out? It was 20 years ago. And Shoghi Effendi said, no, these plans that Abdu'l-Baha had made, this divine plan, was in abeyance for 20 years while we built some administrative machinery. Now it's time to systematically prosecute this plan that Abdu'l-Baha had made. And he launched a plan called the First 7-Year Plan in 1937. And he said the first 7-year plan was just a beginning he said there will be many, many, many more plans. And all of them are part of this divine plan. All of them are part of this divine plan. There will be many more plans in the future. And he interestingly said that future plans will be carried out under the universal house of justice, he said. Which was interesting at that time, because when he said that, he thought that there would be more guardians. Because we thought there would be more guardians. But he said even in the future, even if there were more guardians, still the universal house of justice would carry out more plans. And so we had a plan in 1937, we had another one. And in 1953, Shoghi Effendi launched the first worldwide plan. He said this first worldwide plan was also part of this Tablets of the Divine Plan in 1953. Is anyone here, were they alive in 1953 as a Baha'i? No one was here? Okay. But every now and then I meet Baha'is who remember when Shoghi Effendi first launched the 10-year crusade. It was called the Worldwide Crusade. And he wrote to the Baha'is a very interesting letter to let them understand what they were doing in this part of the plan, in that stage of the plan. He says, this is what you are doing. He said, you Baha'is that are carrying out this 10-year plan, 10-year crusade, are part of a vast, majestic process. Okay, a vast, majestic process. And he says the vast, majestic process has 10 parts. 10 parts to the vast, majestic process. Does anyone know what those 10 parts are? Anyone, does anyone know? Well, I would just love to have been alive in 1953 and to have got this letter from Shoghi Effendi when he described the 10 parts of the plan. So I'm going to tell you what they are. And you have to memorize them because I'm going to test you after the class. He says that there is a process, a vast, majestic process, and it's in 10 parts. He says the process commenced 6,000 years ago. Okay? So the process began 6,000 years ago. He says with the planting of a tree and the growing of a tree. So step one of the process is a tree growing. And it started 6,000 years ago. I'll read what he says. Process commenced 6,000 years ago with the planting in the soil of the divine will of the tree of divine revelation, and which has already passed through certain stages and must needs pass through others. He says the first part was the slow and steady growth of this tree of divine revelation, successively putting forth its branches, shoots, and offshoots, and revealing its leaves, buds, and blossoms as a direct consequence of the light and warmth imparted to it by a series of progressive dispensations associated with Moses, Zoroaster, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, and other prophets, and of the vernal showers of blood shed by countless martyrs in their path. So, step one is a 6,000-year tree that's growing, and the tree has many branches. One of them's Abraham, one's Moses, one's Zoroaster, one's Buddha, and it's watered, he says, by the showers of the blood of the martyrs for all those religions. Isn't it a beautiful image? 6,000-year tree? So that's stage one, the growing of the tree of revelation, he calls it. He says the second part of this process was the fruition of that tree. Because you know every tree grows for a long time and then finally it bears fruit. And it can grow for a very long time before it bears fruit. Of course, in Singapore, they say you don't have any fruit trees. Is that right? You do have fruit trees? Oh, I thought your fruit all comes from other parts of the world.
Yeah, fruit trees down here.
You have fruit trees. But you know you plant a fruit tree, it grows for a long, long time. In America, sometimes the tree takes 5 to 10 years before it fruits. So he says, part two was the fruition of that tree. And he says the second part was the fruition of this tree. He says, when the Bab appeared as the perfect fruit and declared his mission in Shiraz in 1844. So, part one is 6,000 years. Part two is one night. Part two is one night. So in terms of duration, they're quite different. But there was a tree that was growing, and then finally it yielded its fruit when the Bab declared to Mulk Hussain in 1844, and that was the fruition of the tree. Shoghi Effendi says part three is that this fruit that came from this tree of revelation, it had a seed inside it. Because you know fruits have seeds inside it. And you know how a seed has oil if you grind it? He says the oil in that seed was ground for 6 years until 6 years later it yielded oil. When the Bab was martyred in the city of Tabriz, 6 years later, the seed from the fruit, from the tree of Revelation, yielded oil. So isn't this a nice little analogy? The whole thing is like the growing of a tree into a fruit, into a seed, grinding the seed into oil 6 years later. And he says the fourth part was that the oil that came from that seed was ignited. The oil was ignited, he says, in the Sia Shah in 1853. When Baha'u'llah received revelation, it was ignited. He ignited that little tiny bit of oil that came from the tiny seed, that came from the fruit, that came from the revelation 6,000 years. So this little tiny light was ignited by Baha'u'llah in the Sia Shah. The fifth, he said, was in 1863, when the little flame that came from the lighting of that seed was clothed in a lamp. You know, when you put a glass around a light, it makes the light spread further, isn't that right? He says it was clothed in a lamp in 1863 already. He says the fifth, the clothing of that flickering light, which had scarcely penetrated the adjoining territory of Iraq, in the lamp of revelation, after an eclipse lasting no less than 10 years in the city of Baghdad. So he says it took 10 years from the lighting of that oil to a flickering thing to put the light on. He says then the sixth was the spread of the radiance of the light. So I want you to see this in your mind. See a tree growing for 6,000 years, see a little fruit being born, the fruit has a seed, it grinds, there's a little oil, they light that oil in the Sia Shah, and now they put a lamp on it and the lamp is here. And he says the sixth was the spread of that light. It starts to spread. The spread of the light, shining with added brilliancy in its crystal globe in Adrianople and later in Akka, to 13 countries in the Asiatic and African continents. So it spreads across, if you look at, here's where the light came, it spreads to Africa, and here, and over to India, North, and just 13 countries. He says that. The seventh, he said, was in projection from the Most Great Prison in the course of the ministry of Abdu'l-Baha. So he says, during Abdu'l-Baha's life, the light kept spreading. Now, how far did the light spread from that little corner of that area of the globe during Abdu'l-Baha's lifetime? Who can see the light? Where did it go? He says it spread, its illumination, to 20 more countries, 20 sovereign states and dependencies in America, Europe, and even Australia. So there the light's going all over America and down. You see how the light is spreading? That's what he says. That was the seventh part. The eighth part of the process, he says, was the diffusion of that light in the course of the first and opening epoch of the formative age. The formative age began in 1921. And he says, starting in 1921 until 1953, that period of 21 to 53 was the eighth stage. And then he describes in great detail how that light just kept spreading, spreading, spreading. He says, over 94 sovereign states. It's pretty good, isn't it? 94 sovereign states, the light just kept spreading. He says, 94 sovereign states, dependencies, and islands of the planet. Did it reach Singapore during that stage? Did Singapore get the light of the faith before 1953?
Yes.
It did.
51.
51. So in this period, what we call the eighth stage. As a result of the prosecution of a series of national plans initiated by 11 national spiritual assemblies throughout the Baha'i world. So it was because of this plan now that it started to grow. And then he says there was a ninth stage. He says the ninth part of this process, the stage we are entering now. So he's writing to the Baha'is in 1953, and he says there's been 8 stages and we're now entering a 9th stage. So I would have gotten really excited in 1953 because I would have realized that, ooh, we're entering a whole new stage. He says the 9th part of this process, the stage we are entering now, is the further diffusion of that same light over 131 additional territories and islands in both the Eastern and Western Hemisphere through the operation of a decade-long world spiritual crusade whose termination will, God willing, coincide with the Most Great Jubilee, commemorating the centenary of the declaration of Baha'u'llah in Baghdad. So now he's saying that the ninth stage, in this vast majestic process that goes back 6,000 years, the ninth stage is going to finish with the centenary of Baha'u'llah's declaration, which is, of course, was 1963. So we knew that the ninth stage was only going to be 10 years. The whole plan gets one stage. Is that amazing? In other words, all the manifestations of God, Christ, Muhammad, Buddha, Krishna, they got one total. Okay, and we Baha'is, from 53 to 63, we get one stage too? Why is that? It's the mystery of divine plan, how it grows. And then he said, and finally the 10th part. What do you think is the 10th part? He says, the 10th part of this mighty process must be the penetration of that light in the course of numerous crusades and of successive epochs of both the formative and golden age of the faith into all the remaining territories of the globe through the erection of the entire machinery of Baha'u'llah's administrative order in all territories, both east and west, the stage at which the light of God's triumphant faith, shining in all its power and glory, will have suffused and enveloped the entire planet. So what is the 10th stage? It's from 1963 until the light of Baha'u'llah's faith has suffused every single spot on the planet. What stage are we in now? We're in the 10th stage. Okay, because the 10th stage, they said there will be numerous plans, numerous crusades, numerous epochs. So do you think that the Baha'is in the 1950s, 53 to 63, got a feeling of where they stood in relation to the great plan? Shoghi Effendi wanted Baha'is to understand how we fit into an evolving plan that began 6,000 years ago. And I told you at the beginning of today that I looked at every House of Justice message, the beginning of every House of Message for 50 years. Remember I told you that? Because I was looking to see if there's any quotation. I didn't find any other quotation from Baha'u'llah. But when I got to exactly 50 messages ago, the very first Rizvan message the House ever wrote, I looked at the very first paragraph. And you know